so you're now catching me doing the, I guess, the dirtiest thing that I have to do to this piece, which is using epoxy filler. We've got these old nail holes that were really badly rotted out. Well, I don't know if rot is the right word. Wherever the nails were set originally was damaged. The wood fibers were really dry. I guess what would you say? Is that dry rot, Dave? What do you call that when the conditions are dry but you've got damaged?
I've never understood the whole concept of dry rot.
Okay.
Dry rot always seemed like intermittent wet rot.
Okay.
Intermittent wet rot when you catch it on a day that isn't wet.
Okay. So with these nail holes where we had to remove the nails, you know, the nail head was not very big, but all of the wood around it was fibrous and dry. And
many times I've looked at things like that and thought maybe there's something I don't know about rust. That the iron particles that migrate into the wood in the process of rusting are actually doing something to attract moisture.
Oh.
But at the same time, I also do know, and you know, that when the climatic conditions change,
Yep.
that you'll frequently see condensation, and you see condensation a lot of times on things that have a high specific heat that hold their temperature well.
Yeah, something with a lot of mass.
And there's a specific heat. There's how much heat per gram of whatever something can hold, or how much energy it takes to change their temperature.
You'll see more dew on a piece of metal in the morning than on a piece of wood.
Precisely.
Got it.
And that, when you're in those conditions, and in some times of the year, that happens every morning or
Yeah.
every evening.
Okay.
So that, even though it's happening inside of a piece of wood, I think some of that moisture still migrates and causes that wood around that nail to get wet.
Okay.
We're talking about hundreds of years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a casual thing. This is 200 years of sometimes every morning and every evening getting a little bit damp. And the bugs are there and ready to go whenever conditions get good for them.
Okay. They'll take any opportunity to...
And the spores will stay there if the bugs themselves die. The spores will still be there.
Okay.
So the dry rot, I once again don't know what it is. We all grew up hearing about dry rot.
Yep.
I think I've never seen any rot in any dry locations.
Okay.
I see rot in places that are dry some days and wet some days. And when it does dry, it gets very like styrofoam, you know, bodiless.
Yeah.
The fungi are eating something specific out of the wood, the stuff that makes it cling together, the lignin,
Yep.
and leaving the husks of these proteins that they don't eat, and so you get this sponge effect.
Mm-hmm.
It's a funny kind of rot. It's not like when a tomato rots. It's sort of like just digests the whole of the tomato. Someday you're gonna you know 2 years later you come upon this tomato in the corner of the cellar, and all that's left is the skin, and the rest of it is deflated like a Goodyear balloon.
Yeah.
The wood doesn't deflate because some of the structure isn't being eaten by the
And
fungus.
that would be the mineral structure and some of the carbon. The plant, the bugs and the fungi don't eat carbon, right?
You know what? I can't speak to it, but I'm sure that it's something very much like that.
Okay. Well, one way or another, there was quite a bit of rot where any of these larger nails were. Kind of surprisingly, with the exception of the upper molding, which was completely rot. It was completely shit, and it had an ant colony living in it. This lower molding piece had the biggest signs of that type of rot, where the nails were. Anywhere else on the structure, there were nails going through the backer boards, there were nails holding everything together. It seemed that maybe it appeared that there's more rot here because it's such a thin section. I'm sure if I extracted the rafter nails and really inspected the holes on the tops of the old rafters, I would probably see something similar. But this struck me as to how large those holes had become. But, you know, again, it was going through a ½ an inch or less of material on this molding.
Now that upper hollow and round that you're working on right now,
Yep.
Can we assume that that's been put back in the condition that it was when you got it? In other words, that's how those pieces were put together, the three pieces?
Yes, this is, yeah.
And they almost seem like sort of organized, a big piece on the left and a big piece on the right and then a piece in the middle, but the piece in the middle doesn't actually even look like it's in the middle.
It's a little bit off center.
Sort of in the middle.
Yeah, it's sort of in the middle. Kind of surprised me, because if you look at the width of the board that they would have to carve these side pieces out of, that would have to be an extremely wide board.
Yeah.
Now, if they had gone with a wider board for the middle section and had it come out, you know, twice its own length, then it would have eliminated a lot of the major issues with the ends here. Because the end grain is running this way, they could have solved for a majority of these end issues if they had just gone with a wider middle section, and then instead of having grain going like this for the sides, you'd have grain going like this, you know, almost perfectly in line.
You know, to that end, I'll say that it's almost like somehow they hadn't been already doing this very same stuff for 1,000 years before. It seems like they were inventing the process. And it seemed like that they weren't concerning themselves with it at all.
Well, I think you've kind of made that point, is that some of what we see from the old ways, and by old I mean by American standards, a lot of what we see, they weren't thinking about this as being a standing historical document. They were thinking of it as a modern home. And who knows, the next war,
It burns down.
It might get burned down, you know?
Sure.
Now that being said, they were very successful at building buildings that lasted, you know, hundreds of years.
Well, part of the reason is they didn't have styrofoam, you know, vinyl.
Sure.
And so they were stuck with natural materials, which over thousands of years of using them, they'd gotten pretty good at utilizing. So now, just a quick run through. What's next on this thing for those people that are hoping that someday this is going to go back in place?
Next.
You talked about the fluted board.
I'd like to get this fluted ceiling in.
I'm sure we'd like to see it.
I finally feel like I have a plan of attack on it. There's a few sections that I'll need to patch. I'm going to have to probably clamp the whole thing down on the bench, dimension a piece of pine, and then hand plane channels for any of the patches. There are several very small sections that I need to patch, sort of chipped ends from the flutes. I'm feeling like that's going to be trickier than making the larger patch that I need to, you know. It's one thing if you have, you know, a guide to work off of and you're able to plane a larger patch. Even if there's variation, it will kind of disappear into the background. But with these smaller ends that I've got to put in, it's going to be pretty noticeable if they're out of scale in any way. So that's going to have to be the next thing. That's my plan tomorrow, is to set that on the bench, as well as start doing the glue up of the rough pieces for making the upper moldings.
Great. Well, we're definitely going to want to see that.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.